Hi, we continue in Luke 18 today as they approach Jericho, as you can see on the left side of the screen. The first location that's been named since we began the long journey to Jerusalem that you can see structured on the right side of the screen in the chiasm that went down the left side through the middle here with a lament over Jerusalem and up this side. And as we've been looking at this last section from 1711 through 1948, we've been paying attention to the chiastic partners along the way that help us to interpret. And it's one of the elements that I went over in the introduction to this unit of how faulty presuppositions can happen when one doesn't take account of the chiastic partner on the other side of the journey. So in our particular case, the question is about the invitation to discipleship. We'll look back in a minute at how in those last verses of chapter 9 we hear 3 times that people have excuses for why not to follow, and then we'll see in our immediate passage and the one with Zacchaeus that follows, a blind person and a tax collector who both follow Jesus. So the invitation came here, and for the first time we're hearing following. Since then, we'll hear that here. And the fact that we're near Jericho is important because Jericho is the last stop on the way to Jerusalem. You can see from the map of Jesus' time here, but you can also see from a modern image from Google Maps that it's less than a 10-hour journey, less than 35 or 36 kilometers, and the road up to Jerusalem is the final stretch of this journey. An element of that that's interesting, it's kind of hidden in the text, but I'm paying close attention and hoping you are too, is that a number of words in Greek are used in this passage that are used a number of times after this, but that we haven't heard since before the travel narrative began. So Luke is beginning to shift the language here toward the arrival in Jerusalem and the various challenges from the elite in Jerusalem that will lead to his crucifixion, and focusing on the theme that we've been looking at throughout this entire section of preparing the disciples for Jesus' rejection and themselves to be rejected. So we've been looking at that along the way in under 3 categories: the green for the poor or non-elite, the blue for the disciples that we saw last time, where they did not understand the passion portent, and the purple for Rome, Jerusalem, or the elite. And I characterize those who are described as in front, you can see in verse 39 here, as among the non-elite because they're not anybody we know of having any authority. It's just part of the crowd who are there. So whether those are disciples or we last saw the 12, who were those who didn't understand what Jesus was about, heading to Jerusalem to be rejected, or the Pharisees who are not named here, it certainly suggests that it's just people in the crowd who want to silence that person. Perhaps it's because they think there are more important things to do, or perhaps they think this person is not worthy of Jesus' time. We can't know that for sure, but that's part of the element of rejection we're seeing here. And the link between the chiastic partners we already noticed, and we'll see that more as we go. So let's look at also how Luke has shaped the story that he inherited from Mark, and we can see Matthew's differences as well. In the last comparison we made, we noted how Luke had shortened the previous story, leaving out some elements here. Here it's longer than Matthew's. It's Matthew who leaves out things, and mainly leaving out the poignant detail we find in Mark here around calling the blind man and telling him to take heart, get up, he's calling you, and he's throwing off his cloak and springing up, much like the man at the beautiful gate in Acts 3, which is of course part of Luke's story. But Matthew and Luke both leave out that poignant description, as well as the name of the person, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, which simply is what Bartimaeus means, son of Timaeus, so that's a repetition there for those who don't understand the original Hebrew there. So what we see and what Luke has done is the story takes place as they approach Jericho. In Mark, they came to Jericho, and as they were leaving Jericho, the beggar was sitting by the way. And many translations have the roadside, but especially in Luke, that's missing the point that in Acts, the Gospel of Jesus is known as the capital W in English, way, which is to say hodos in Greek, which can mean road, but plainly means on the way. Luke isn't concerned with the physical thing they're walking on as much as the sense of a path, a journey that they're on. Much like we hear in the Hebrew Bible, in the Septuagint, which is key to Luke, about walking with Yahweh or walking on the path of Yahweh. So that's the language we hear here. And as we noted last time, the blind man sitting by the way begging is certainly, at least at one level, a metaphor for the disciples who found in the last scene that the word of the cross, or the word of Jesus' suffering, was hidden from their eyes. And in the previous scene with the rich man who walks away sad, Peter followed it up and said, "We have left everything, what are we going to get?" And although Jesus promised that they would get much in this age and in the age to come eternal life, at the moment they have nothing. So at the moment, they are the blind beggar, or at least in the same position as the blind beggar, not able to see the message of Jesus and without money. Ironically, it's the blind beggar who will know exactly what's going on here, and we'll see a number of ways in which he exemplifies, along with Zacchaeus in the next story, the very path of discipleship that the rich man and the 9 lepers and the Pharisees, as stand-in for Luke's audience of the wealthy Roman elite, all reject in this path, in these scenes or beyond. Let's look as we start our story here as he approached Jericho, blind men and blind people in Luke. And it's especially important in Luke because Luke starts off, as we saw back in 4:18, with Jesus' mission statement from Isaiah 61, that the Spirit of the Lord is upon him, and part of what he's called to do is bring recovery of sight to the blind. And it hasn't happened yet directly in the story. We hear the parable in 6:39, can a blind person guide a blind person? And the answer is obviously no. And that has something at least implicit to what we see in our scene of the 12 as potential leaders who are blind to the way of Jesus, and they certainly can't be guiding people. But we heard in chapter 7 when John the Baptist sent 2 of his people to find out whether Jesus was the one to come or whether they should wait for another. The narrator tells us he'd given sight to many who were blind. And when he answers, he says, "Go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive their sight." But we as readers have not seen it. This is just a summary from the narrator, and Jesus suggests that John is actually, or John's witnesses have actually seen that happen, but we don't see it in the story. Then in chapter 14, we see 2 examples of inviting people to the banquet. Invite the poor, crippled, lame, and blind. And in the story about the rich people who refuse the invitation for reasons that aren't named in the story, but we explored in the video at the time, when they don't come, to bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame to your banquet. So in Jesus' story, the blind are to be included, and his mission is to heal the blind, but we haven't seen it yet. Now we're going to see it. So let's put our comparison up, and we can follow that as we go. So as I was noting, as he approached Jericho, and the root word here for engizo is echoed, as we'll see when he's brought near to Jesus. So as Jesus approaches Jericho, so then we have the blind man. Literally, it's someone blind. It doesn't say his gender, although the pronouns are male, but that's just grammatical default. So we don't have to see this as a man here, but it's certainly likely within the story. So a blind person was sitting by the way begging. It's the only one other time do we see begging, and that's the story of the unjust manager who says, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I can't be a beggar. Which is to say, it's not that he's too proud to be a beggar. He says he's ashamed, but the issue is that that wouldn't help him any because people would reject him. So he came up with another way to establish his security there. But this person, real person or metaphorical person, we can't distinguish, is finding himself begging in utter dependence upon others. And notice how different the encounter is. In Mark, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, was sitting by the way, and when he heard it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out. In Luke's version, he heard a crowd going by, and he asked what was happening or who it was, as we'll see in a minute. They told him it was Jesus of Nazareth. So it takes the crowd's intervention for him to understand what's happening, and that's just an interesting little symbolic element there, that in Mark, Bartimaeus recognizes Jesus on his own, although he heard it was Jesus, but he doesn't ask the question. And then here the crowd intervenes to help him. So that's what we're looking at here. So he heard a crowd going by, and as Green notes, the disciples have faded into the background, indistinguishable from others who have joined the parade around Jesus. And in the last scene, we saw the 12 called aside, so it wasn't the disciples who were told about his going to Jerusalem and being rejected. It was only the 12. So we heard about them going by. Dia par ua meno here, we've seen that only a couple times, but interestingly at 13:22, I'll go back to that for a second, right at the center of the journey to Jerusalem chiasm. He's made his way to Jerusalem, going through one village after another. It's the going through that's similar to the word here, the crowd going by or going through. So as I was noting, it's translated what has happened, but tia tautu can be who this was as well as what this was. So, and the who certainly seems to make sense because their answer is in terms of a who, although his passing by implies what was happening. So it could be either way. So they told him here, answering him many times as we saw. And note that It's only here that we hear Jesus of Nazareth said out loud. Here, he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth. Matthew leaves that out altogether, just heard that Jesus was passing by. And in terms of Jesus of Nazareth, like in John 18, but the phrase in in Luke is only 2 other times. Here it was the demon, the unclean spirit, who said, "We know who you are, Jesus of Nazareth." And in 24:19, we'll see it in the road to Emmaus, when they talk to the risen Jesus, but they don't know who it is, and they say the things about Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet. So only a couple of times that's raised here, is passing by. So then he shouted, boao here, used in Luke as an expression of seeking of divine aid, back in the call with John the Baptist, back in chapter 3, and we've seen it one other time. We also see the leper shout, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." So the "have mercy on us" matches the blind person with the lepers, as well as with the rich man shouting, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me," and that's not heard because he was not paying attention to Lazarus, as we recall from that. So, as I note here below, this is a rare naming of Jesus by someone other than a demon or by the narrator. Only in the leper story we saw here, and one other time later, and then in that same scene in John. So it's rare that characters call him Jesus among many titles. And then we get, surprisingly, out of nowhere, Son of David. And let's look at David in Luke for a few minutes, because it's really important for those who think Jesus is the Messiah because he's the son of David, which this text definitely says he is. In the genealogy we hear it here, son of David. I've color-coded this chart according to what about David is at issue. So the purple ones are son of David, or family of David. The green one here is house of David, and the blue one is city of David. And I made this one somewhere between the green and blue because it has both city of David and a house and family of David there. So when we started, there was a clear promise of give him the throne of his father David, and that Joseph was from the house of David. For anybody concerned whether the Messiah has to be from the house of David, yes, he is according to that, although we know that Joseph is not his literal father, and so he's not literally from the house of David, only by Joseph not rejecting the Virgin Mary, who's been impregnated by the angel Gabriel, as far as we can tell there, or somehow. And so then we get to the continuing in the infancy narratives, that Joseph went to the city of David called Bethlehem for the census there, because he's from the house and family of David. So we're reminded of it there. And then the angelic host shout, "To you is born this day in the city of David." So Jerusalem is the city of David. And then we see the genealogy. In chapter 6, Jesus uses David as an example, and that's a story from Samuel when he's running away from Saul, and he goes and eats the showbread in a place where also the sword of Goliath is, but that's another story here. But he's certainly using that as an example of David breaking the Sabbath in order to eat. Then we have our immediate scene, and then we'll have in chapter 20, when he's confounding his opponents there, an interesting element that seems to undo everything else we heard back in the infancy stories. He makes a little argument from the Psalms, assuming that David is the author of the Psalms, which is traditional until modern scholarship. So in the psalm attributed to David, the quote is, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool," which leads Jesus to conclude, logically, David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son? So he leaves it as a rhetorical question, but you notice he doesn't speak about himself there. He's speaking abstractly about the question, how can they say the Messiah is David's son? But he's not claiming he's the Messiah, and he's not called Messiah here. He's simply called son of David, which does not equate to Messiah. David had a number of sons, and they weren't all Messiahs. Ask Adonijah, who wanted to be one and turned out to die, and being replaced by his brother Solomon, who became the Messiah there. So being son of David doesn't make you the Messiah, but even if you were the son of David, and even if you were the Messiah, why would that lead someone to think that you could heal blind people? Because there's nothing about the tradition of David that he's anything other than a clever military leader and a charming ladies' man to a number of women, and able to charm even the Philistines to not kill him and let him hide there for a while. So we know about David's persuasive powers, and we know about his military powers, but we don't know anything about any other kinds of powers. So there's no particular reason that a blind beggar, who we find out in a few verses wants to see again, should refer to Jesus as son of David as a basis to appreciate his authority as someone who can do that. But that's what we hear here, and of course it's taken from Mark, but Luke leaves it in. So have mercy on me, as I noted, connecting him with the leper and tragically with the rich man. But those who were in front, and this is where we hear this here, the only time in Luke we hear the phrase hoi proagantes, as Trainer notes, they could conceivably represent those in front of Luke's household who hold positions of leadership and authority and have the power to bring or prevent the disenfranchised and struggling into communion and discipleship. But that assumes there are people who hold positions of leadership and authority in a Lucan community or Lucan household, and we'll have to get to Acts of the Apostles before we can evaluate that claim. Brookins, in a 2011 article on the passage, notes this: although on one level this reversal of roles is meant in a spatial sense, it also audibly echoes Jesus' discussion of who wants to be first in importance. And certainly that's an element here, that the spatial and the authoritative are certainly overlapping here. Just like the way is a spatial reference, but also one about the path you're on spiritually. So those who are in front sternly ordered, using the strong word for rebuking here, to be quiet, using one of a number of words for silencing. We saw sigase here back in 936, and we'll see it again in chapter 20. But as you can see from my note below, there are other words for silencing, because silencing is certainly something the elite want to do, especially to the poor then and now, to keep the elite power in place, to keep them from being challenged, usually with threats of violence, whether that's the police or the military or some other threats, but often just from the crowd shouting people down. And we know in our era of social media how people who say things that are unpopular within a certain circle can easily be silenced by a barrage of social media responses. So whether it's technologically or otherwise, we know how crowds can attempt to silence people who dare to speak up. But instead, she shouts even more the louder, using the word krazo, which is normally the word for crying out. And it's interesting that it's translated here the same way as it boazo here, when it could be translated cry out, which is the standard word throughout the Septuagint for the crying of the oppressed to God for help. Even more loudly here, Paulo Malon, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stood still, just as he will for Zacchaeus. So in this story and the next one, a person from the crowd will interrupt Jesus, and Jesus will stand still to hear what they have to say. And not only did he stand still, he ordered the man to be brought near. I wonder how the people in front felt about that. We don't hear who does it, and we don't hear any response for it, but it is brought near. So to be brought near, ago, is 13 times in Luke, but this is one of those examples. 7 of those 13, and this is the 8. So 8 of the 13 are here and after. And then he came near, and Gizo, echoing that we noted they came near to Jericho. And he asked the question that echoes through all 3 synoptics: what do you want me to do for you? And notice that Jesus obviously knows as the blind person. What else could he want? But he asked the question anyway and invites him to respond. Notice in Mark, it's my teacher, let me see. In Matthew, who has 2 blind men, Matthew often has doubles in that kind of context. Lord, let our eyes be opened. And Luke also has Lord. So that's why I have this in green here. It's common to Matthew and Luke, just as the shouted was there. So, Lord, let me see again. And that's an interesting title in relation to Son of David. Let me see again, anablepso, 3 times in the next 3 verses, and highlighting he's not like the person in John 9. He's not blind from birth. So this is not a rebirth story like the one in John 9, when Jesus makes the saliva or makes mud from his saliva in the soil as a symbol of Genesis 2:7, the creating of human beings from the dust of the earth and the Spirit of God. Here, this is seeing again, someone who knew how to see but became blinded. And the suggestion is, like the apostles or like the disciples, blinded by the message of the religious elite in Jerusalem, who are in conspiracy with the Romans to maintain the Roman status quo, the Pax Romana. So he wants to see again, and Jesus says, receive your sight, fulfilling the promise that brings sight to the blind, and also what we saw in 7:22. Notice, receive your sight, see again, matching the word exactly. So he says, I want to see again, and we could just hear, see again. That would make it more parallel. Your faith has saved you. And this is really key, because we note a little earlier in the story of the lepers, the end of the story was, when the human one comes, will he find faith on earth? Well, he finds it right here. And the question here about saved had to do, as we saw in the last scene, where Peter said, then who can be, or Peter doesn't say, Peter says, what do we have? But when the rich man walks away sad, people ask, who then can be saved? Well, the answer is, a blind person who trusts in Jesus can be saved, along with, as we'll see in the next scene, a tax collector. And so our scene ends with the following mark here. Immediately he regained his sight and followed him. And followed, akolatheo is exactly one of those words, as you can see here, that we saw last in 557 to 61, and now we see it in 1822. Right back here, one thing lacking to the rich man, follow me, but he didn't. And now this person does it. Let's go back just briefly and look at that scene in 57 to 61 so we can see how it chiastically echoes across our passage here. So these were three excuses for following, in contrast to what we see here. Someone said, I will follow you, and Jesus says there's not going to be any home. Another, Jesus calls him to follow, and he has an excuse of, let me bury my father first, and Jesus says, let the dead bury their dead. As for you, go and proclaim the kingdom. But we don't hear that it happens. And a third offers to follow, but first he wants to say goodbye to those at home, and Jesus says no one has put their hand to the plow and looks back as fit. So all three of those seem to be rejected attempts to follow with sort of some kind of excuse. But the blind beggar has no reason for an excuse. We don't know that he has any family. If he did, why would he be begging? Or he has any home, even, for that matter. He might, but we don't know about it. So someone who is a blind beggar who has nothing left to lose, who in other words is like a Roman who gives up his authority and gives up his elite status and picks up his cross daily, is ready to follow and to glorify God, like the one leper did, but like the other 9 lepers did not. And all the people that we've seen a number of times, you can see below, using Laos here, again, first of 19 uses in the remainder of Luke, but the last one is 9:13, another example of the words that were not used in the travel narrative until now. As Brookins notes again, there are therefore 2 sets of behaviors, each corresponding with a group within the oikos, which is the crowd. We have those who are desirous to be in front and who leverage their arrogated authority to hinder the work of God, and we have the people of God, Laos, who respond appropriately to his work. And that's what we hear here when they praise God, anon here, only Matthew 21 elsewhere in the New Testament. And so now, having done that, he enters Jericho, and he's not done in Jericho yet. And we'll see how not only is this the story that follows connected with the blind person, it really ties together everything that we've seen in our last unit so far. So we'll see you next time for that one. Bye-bye.